In the world of organized crime, power is fleeting, but death is absolute. When the Mafia marks a man for execution, there is no escape. Only the inevitable moment when flesh is torn by bullets, bones shatter like brittle glass, and the pavement drinks deep from the crimson tide. Some men see it coming, staring into the barrel of fate, while others never hear the gunfire that seals their doom. Tonight, we're unearthing 5 of the most savage mob hits in history. Executions so brutal they sent shockwaves through the underworld. And we begin with Stefano Ferrigno, a man who climbed the ranks of the New York Mafia only to be torn apart in a storm of lead and found face down in a river of his own blood, his empire stolen by the very men he once called allies. Stefano Ferrigno was born on May 12th at the turn of the 20th century in Sicily. He spent his childhood in his native land, learning what he could from family and friends. It wasn't long before he emigrated across the pond into the United States, where his Italian connections would serve him. During the mid-1910s, the young teenage boy embedded himself with New York's Italian Mafia, cementing his path into darkness. The Brooklyn docks, rife with corruption, were a natural breeding ground for men of Ferrigno's disposition. The sweat-drenched longshoremen labored under the unspoken but universally understood reality. Everything they touched, every dollar they earned, belonged in part to men like him. Emerging as a figure of influence, Ferrigno maneuvered through criminal enterprises with ruthless efficiency. While convention-dictated Sicilians remained within their own syndicates, he defied expectation by forging ties with the Neapolitan Camorra, a deviation that proved lucrative. Under Salvatore Toto d'Aquila's rule, Ferrigno's operations expanded. Bootlegging, extortion, and labor racketeering became his domain, with the Brooklyn waterfront serving as both his base and proving ground. Workers operated under his dictates, their livelihoods dependent on compliance. Resistance was brief, and when necessary, it was extinguished with finality. The foundation of his empire, however, was contingent on d'Aquila's dominance. In 1928, when bullets silenced D'Aquila in an orchestrated assassination, Ferrigno faced a decisive moment. Aligning with the victor, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, was not a choice, it was survival. With D'Aquila eliminated, Ferrigno and his associate Alfred Mineo filled the power vacuum. Endorsed by Masseria, they assumed control of a sprawling network of illicit enterprises. Their syndicate, comprised of hundreds of men, dealt in gambling rackets, smuggling and extortion with violence as an unspoken but ever-present enforcement mechanism. The city, however, was fracturing. Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist, sought absolute authority, igniting the Castellamarese War. As loyalists to Masseria, Ferrigno and Mineo became entrenched in the conflict. Blood stained the streets as rival factions engaged in systematic assassinations, each eliminating key figures in a calculated attrition of power. Despite their entrenched position, fractures appeared within their ranks. D'Aquila loyalists defected to Maranzano's cause, weakening their hold. The balance of power shifted subtly but unmistakably. Ferrigno, ever perceptive, likely recognized the inevitability of their decline. Still, retreat was not an option. The war dictated that one either emerged victorious or perished. The meeting at the Alhambra apartments was routine in appearance, yet its consequences were anything but. Ferrigno, Mineo and other key figures convened, deliberating strategies to maintain their diminishing grip on power. Unbeknownst to them, across the courtyard, Maranzano's executioners observed their every movement. Joe Profaci, Nick Capuzzi, Joe Valacci and others lay in wait, weapons readied. Hours passed, plans were discussed, cigars smouldered to ash. Then Ferrigno and Mineo departed, stepping into the open. The ambush was swift and methodical. A barrage of gunfire erupted, tearing through flesh and bone before either man could react. Ferrigno crumpled under the assault, his lifeblood pooling onto the cold pavement. Mineo met the same fate, both men silenced before their bodies struck the ground. Their deaths marked the unravelling of Masseria's dominion. Stripped of key allies, his empire faltered, culminating in his assassination months later. Maranzano, momentarily triumphant, would himself be eliminated in due course, paving the way for a new order led by Charles Lucky Luciano. Ferrigno was buried in Calvary Cemetery, his legacy reduced to a name among the many who had risen, reigned, and been unceremoniously erased by the inevitability of underworld politics. The Mafia has one rule: never show weakness. Cesare Chet Lemare broke it, and it cost him his life. Once a ruthless enforcer, he ascended through Detroit's criminal hierarchy by spilling blood without hesitation. But arrogance breeds missteps, and Lemare made one too many. When the order for his execution came, it wasn't delivered in the form of a raging gun battle. It came in the shape of a familiar face, a trusted hand that pulled the trigger. One bullet, expertly placed, and Lemare's body hit the ground, his lifeblood draining into the floor of his own home. His fortress of steel and firepower couldn't save him from the most dangerous weapon of all: betrayal. This is the brutal and savage tale of a man who learned too late that in the Mafia, trust is a death sentence. Cesare Chester Lemare's tenure in Detroit's underworld was brief, defined by strategic violence and inevitable retribution. His end was neither unexpected nor mourned in the circles where power was measured in blood. The empire he sought to control was built on shifting sands, and his miscalculations ensured his downfall would be as swift as his ascent. The onset of his demise was marked by a calculated double murder at a Detroit fish market on May 31st, 1930. Lemare, posturing as a negotiator, lured Gaspar Milazzo and Sam Ferrigno into what they believed was a peace conference. The fish market, thick with the stench of salt and decay, was unremarkable, until the gunfire erupted. The first shots tore through Milazzo's torso, his silk suit darkening as arterial spray flecked the walls. His body convulsed before he crumpled onto the cold, wet floor. Ferrigno made a desperate lunge for the door, slipping in a slick of blood. The gunmen did not rush, they took their time. A final round shattered Ferrigno's skull, leaving bone fragments scattered among the discarded fish guts. The executions were clean, methodical, their message unambiguous. Lemare, emboldened by Masseria's backing, mistook this calculated brutality for dominance. Instead, he had incited a war he could not win. The repercussions were immediate. The alliances Lemare had once relied upon fractured. Those who had once spoken his name with deference now whispered of his imminent demise. First came the retaliation. Joe Marino, Lemare's business partner and enforcer, was found on his doorstep in Dearborn on September 27, 1930, gasping through a ruined chest cavity. His hands twitched as life seeped from him, his blood pooling beneath his crumpled frame. Lemare, sensing the tide turning, fled, first to New York, then Louisville, his movements erratic, his paranoia justified. Meanwhile, Joe Tocco, Lemare's last remaining ally, found himself ensnared in a losing war against the entrenched power of Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco. With every skirmish, every bullet-riddled corpse left on Detroit's frozen streets, Lemare's isolation deepened. By early 1931, he had no choice but to return to Detroit, retreating to his heavily fortified home on Granville Avenue. Inside, he surrounded himself with weapons: a tear gas gun, 6 revolvers, 2 rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, even grenades. The walls were thick, the doors reinforced. None of it mattered. On the night of February 7th, 1931, Lemare's fate arrived on quiet footsteps. The killer was no stranger. He was welcomed inside. Perhaps Lemare even offered a drink, believing he still held some measure of control. Then came the gunshot. One round, expertly placed, obliterated his illusions. His body collapsed, his fingers twitching reflexively as his pulse slowed. Blood, warm and thick, leaked into the grooves of the floorboards, pooling beneath his lifeless form. His wife's scream shattered the silence, though by then there was nothing left to save. When the authorities arrived, they found not a kingpin, but a corpse. The arsenal he had amassed remained untouched, his preparations rendered meaningless by the betrayal he had not foreseen. Joseph Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco were detained for questioning, but the investigation was cursory. No one expected justice. Detroit's criminal machine continued its relentless churn, unfazed by the elimination of another transient figure. Lemare's name faded, absorbed into the undercurrent of gangland history, his ambitions erased by the very violence that had once secured his rise. He was a cautionary tale, another casualty of the unyielding cycle of blood, power, and retribution.
In the unforgiving world of Detroit's Mafia, survival wasn't promised. It was bought in blood and paid for in flesh. Sam Giannola understood that better than anyone. He had no mercy, no hesitation, and no rivals left breathing. He burned out the competition, sometimes with acid, sometimes with bullets, but always with the precision of a man who knew that fear was the sharpest weapon of all. Yet even the most feared men fall, and when the end came for Giannola, it was no quiet exit, it was an execution. A storm of bullets carving him apart, his body twitching, jerking, breaking as lead shredded his insides. He died choking on his own blood, his empire dissolving in the tide of red that spilled from his lifeless form. Detroit in the early 20th century was a city divided by power and violence, and Sam Giannola found himself at its center. His rise followed the assassination of his brother Tony, leaving him to consolidate control over a criminal enterprise built on coercion and brutality. The path he took was marked by meticulous calculation, strategic bloodshed, and an unrelenting drive to command the city's underworld. Giannola's initial ascent was defined by theft, deception, and calculated intimidation. The theft of olive oil and wine from the D&C steamship line was executed with bureaucratic precision, leveraging fraudulent documentation to misappropriate the shipment. When law enforcement uncovered the stolen goods in a Ford City grocery store owned by the Giannolas, the shipping line declined to press charges, preferring to avoid a confrontation that could end in bloodshed. It was an unspoken agreement in Detroit. Resistance to the Giannolas was an invitation to ruin. By 1915, the Giannolas had achieved an unchallenged monopoly over Wyandottes' produce market through systematic terror. Competitors who refused to yield were dealt with severely. One merchant, Cohen, dared to resist. His defiance was answered with an act of grotesque cruelty. His horse was doused in acid, its agonized screams reverberating through the streets as its flesh sloughed from bone. The message was clear. Cohen vanished soon after, swallowed by the ever-deepening void of those who crossed the wrong men. His shop stood empty, a hollow testament to the cost of defiance. Eliminating competition did not always require overt violence. When Harry Paul and Morris Harris attempted to establish a rival store, Giannola feigned diplomacy. He agreed to purchase their business, issuing a partial payment of $200 on a $7,000 agreement. The ruse lulled them into a false sense of security. When the remaining balance went unpaid and the men pressed for restitution, they were found murdered, their bodies punctured by lead, left crumpled in alleyways as stark warnings. Giannola was arrested, but Detroit's justice system was as malleable as its underground rulers required. With no conclusive evidence, he walked free once more, untouchable by law but ever closer to the reach of his enemies. Following Tony Giannola's death in 1919, Sam's position became increasingly precarious. His brother's assassination marked the onset of a bitter struggle. A failed assassination attempt in February saw his brother-in-law, Pasquale Dani, caught in the crossfire, his body crumpling in the street where the bullets had been meant for Sam. The war had begun in earnest. Convinced of John Vitale's culpability, Giannola retaliated with a drive-by shooting that shredded Vitale's storefront, wood splintering and glass shattering as bullets tore through the facade. The message was clear, but the counterstrikes came swiftly. Vitale, suspecting an ambush, fired on approaching police officers, believing them to be Giannola's men, and was jailed for his error. Violence escalated further when Vitale's allies, Renda, Evola, and Vitale's teenage son, visited him in jail. They were met by Giannola's men, who lay in wait, weapons drawn, eyes cold. The gunfire was clinical, efficient. Renda, his body jerking as more than 20 bullets found their mark, collapsed in a pool of his own blood. Before he succumbed, he gasped out the name of his killer, Sam Giannola. The survivors, wounded and gasping, were left to bleed, their existence a warning rather than an afterthought. The balance of power wavered, but Detroit's streets demanded a final reckoning. Giannola's end came with brutal efficiency on October 2, 1919. As he stepped out of a bank on Russell Street, cashing a routine $200 check, the final reckoning arrived. The first bullet struck his shoulder, twisting his body violently, blood spraying onto the bank's pristine marble steps. He staggered, grasping for the doorway, but the barrage continued. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed as more bullets tore through his flesh, his body convulsing with each impact. More than 24 rounds struck him before he collapsed inside, the cold floor slick with his blood. The execution had been thorough, absolute. Sam Giannola did not meet his end in an opulent estate or surrounded by his loyal men. His final moments were spent sprawled on the bank floor, breath coming in ragged gasps as life drained from him. His rule ended not in triumph but in silence, another body left to feed the insatiable hunger of Detroit's underworld. The streets had claimed another king, and the cycle of bloodshed continued, indifferent to the names that passed through its grasp.
Before the Mafia had 5 families, before the Commission ruled from the shadows, there was Giuseppe Morello, the first true boss of bosses. His name inspired terror. His methods left corpses that would never be found. With a clawed hand that some swore was the devil's mark, He built an empire on blood and fear. Shopkeepers who refused his demands found their daughters stolen into the night, their bodies lost to the void. Enemies didn't just die, they disappeared, ground into sausage meat and sold to unsuspecting customers in the street markets of Little Italy. But power is fleeting, and the ghosts he created never stopped whispering his name. When the bullets finally came from Morello, they did not just end him. They shredded the legend, leaving behind nothing but a lifeless husk, drowning in its own blood. Giuseppe Morello was born into the kind of darkness that seeps into a man's bones, the kind that twists fate in its grasp. Corleone, Sicily, where blood ran thicker than water, and omerta was a lullaby whispered to children before they could walk. His right hand, a gnarled, claw-like deformity, became his mark, a grotesque thing that made even the hardest of men shudder. Some called it a sign of the devil. Others saw it as an omen of his destiny. Either way, it suited him. His was a world where weakness was an invitation to death, and Giuseppe Morello had no intention of dying. By the late 19th century, Morello's ambition outgrew Sicily. His mentor lay dead in the streets, riddled with bullets meant for anyone who dared threaten the old order. Morello fled to America, a land of opportunity, but for men like him, that opportunity reeked of blood and fire. New York was no Sicilian village, it was chaos, a battleground where only the cunning survived. Morello had no need for brute strength. He had something far more terrifying: patience. He built his empire brick by bloody brick, using fear as currency and silence as his shield. The first fall came swift and sudden. A witness, a woman. Anna di Puma saw him near the corpse of Giovanni Vella, a Sicilian official who had dared try to bring order to a world that thrived in shadows. She spoke, and the message was clear. Morello was a hunted man, but before the noose could tighten, before justice could lay its hands on him, she was gone. A bullet to the temple, a whisper of warning left in her cold, lifeless grip. No witnesses, no justice, no crime. Morello slipped into the streets of New York like poison into a wound. The city was ripe for the taking, its neighborhoods teeming with desperate men willing to kill for scraps. But scraps weren't enough for Morello. He built his empire on deception, weaving a network of rackets that touched every inch of the city. Black-hand extortion, counterfeiting, smuggling, his fingers choked every industry. His name became synonymous with the price of defiance. Men feared him, but they also needed him. That was power. Then came the storm. A body stuffed into a barrel, its flesh carved with the marks of betrayal. Benedetto Madonia, a fool who had crossed Morello's counterfeiting ring. The police swarmed, and for the first time, the noose began to tighten. Morello's name whispered through the precincts, his men dragged into interrogation rooms. But fear was a weapon he wielded well. No one spoke, no one dared. The case collapsed, and Morello walked free, leaving behind only the stench of death and the unspoken truth. Betrayal was met with butchery. Morello's rise seemed unstoppable. He married, had children, but love was a luxury he barely understood. His real devotion was to power, to the empire he had built from the marrow of broken men. He expanded, forged alliances, pulled in the likes of Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, a man just as ruthless, just as hungry. Together they launched an investment scheme, a con wrapped in promises of wealth. Money poured in, but greed is a bottomless pit, and soon the whole house of lies crumbled. Debts mounted, lawsuits followed, and suddenly Morello wasn't the untouchable force he had once been. The final descent came in the form of ink and paper, counterfeit bills flooding the streets, drawing the attention of the one enemy even Morello couldn't silence: the US Secret Service. Their agents moved with precision, peeling apart his operation layer by layer. Informants bled secrets. The walls of his empire cracked. Then, in the dead of night, the inevitable came. The raids, the arrests, the final gasping moments of a dynasty built on treachery. Morello, the first boss of bosses, was shackled and dragged to trial. His twisted hand now a useless relic of a bygone era. Found guilty of counterfeiting in 1910, he was sentenced to a grim 25 years in prison, a fate that seemed as rigid as the bars that confined him. But the unyielding grip of the law was loosened, and in 1922, President Warren Harding, under the dubious guise of mercy, granted him a conditional commutation. an act that would unlock the door to Morello's sinister past. While Morello languished behind bars, his empire was left in the precarious hands of his youngest half-brother Niccolo Terranova. Niccolo wielded power with youthful vigor until the fateful year of 1916, when the violent storm of the Mafia Camorra War swept through Brooklyn. It was then that he fell victim to the ruthless Neapolitan boss, Pellegrino Marano, a predator who left the streets stained with blood and fear. With Niccolo's demise, the Terranova name was left to his remaining brothers, Vincenzo and Ciro, who assumed control over the family, steadfast but burdened by the spectre of Morello's past. Released from the cold walls of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1920, Morello sought to reclaim the throne he had nurtured through a lifetime of treachery. Yet the landscape had shifted beneath him. Salvatore D'Aquila perceived Morello as an encroaching threat. D'Aquila, driven by a ruthless ambition, placed a death sentence upon Morello's head. In the dead of night, Morello melted into the darkness of Sicily alongside others marked for death. Among them loomed Umberto Valenti, a once loyal gunman who now hunted Morello like a wolf chasing a wounded deer, eager to curry favor with D'Aquila once again. A bloodbath ensued, violent and merciless, as loyalties crumbled under the weight of greed and vengeance. But fate intervened. Valenti met his grisly end in August 1922 at the hands of Giuseppe Masseria's men. Some whispered that Charles Luciano himself pulled the trigger, marking Valenti's demise with the kiss of death. With Valenti dispatched to the underworld, D'Aquila's reign began to show cracks, revealing the fragility of his power. Morello, sensing his rule had slipped through his fingers, chose to bide his time, aligning himself with Masseria as a consigliere. The Prohibition years rolled on, and under Masseria's ascendancy, Morello flourished, his ambition reignited. However, the streets still echoed with the tension of war, and between 1930 and 1931, the Castellamarese War erupted into a chaotic blood feast. Masseria and Morello found themselves locked in a lethal struggle against the rising forces of Salvatore Maranzano and Joseph Bonanno. Morello's seasoned hands tightened around the reins of war strategy, earning the title of Masseria's war chief. But war has a way of demanding tribute. And on August 15, 1930, the grim spectre of death claimed Giuseppe Morello in a cold act of violence. While collecting cash receipts in his East Harlem office, he met his end alongside associate Joseph Periano. It was Joseph Valachi, the notorious turncoat of the American Mafia, who would later identify Morello's killer, a Castellamarese gunman known ominously as Buster from Chicago. The streets of New York continued to pulse with danger, promising that treachery and bloodshed were far from over. In this murky world, where trust was as fleeting as smoke, Morello's tale was just one of many written in blood, a harrowing saga of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power. Power in the Mafia is never owned. It's borrowed, paid for in blood, and repossessed with bullets. Manfredi Mineo thought he had secured his kingdom, a sprawling empire of vice built on the corpses of his enemies. He played the game ruthlessly, aligning with kings only to bury them when the tides turned. But in this world, death lurks behind every handshake, and Mineo's final moment came in a Bronx courtyard, where a hidden assassin turned his body into a perforated relic of betrayal. His tailored suit, once a symbol of power, became his burial shroud, soaked in his own blood. Stay tuned as we dissect the meteoric rise and brutal execution of a man who dared to play king in a city that eats its rulers alive. The crisp November air carried the stench of blood and gunpowder through the streets of the Bronx, mingling with the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from the vendors stationed on the corners. The courtyard on Pelham Parkway had fallen eerily silent after the eruption of gunfire, leaving only the distant wail of sirens slicing through the darkening sky. Manfredi Mineo and Stefano Ferrigno lay crumpled amidst the withered autumn leaves, their bodies riddled with bullets, their finely tailored suits drenched in crimson. The echoes of their final gasps had long since dissipated into the cold night. The predators had struck and in their precision had dismantled an empire. Before the war, Before the betrayals, Mineo had been a titan in Brooklyn. He carried himself with the weight of his station, stoic, calculated, always watching. He knew power was not just taken, it was secured, fortified, and locked away from the grasping hands of those who would dare steal it. Under Salvatore d'Aquila, Mineo had built his fiefdom, a shadow empire of bootlegging, gambling and extortion that slithered through the borough like a silent, merciless serpent. But in New York, power was always shifting, always bleeding. Mineo had learned that lesson early when Valenti had been gunned down in the streets, his lifeless body a testament to the ruthless chess game the Mafia played. So when the tides changed and Masseria emerged as the new kingmaker, Mineo did what survivors did best. He adapted. He knelt before the new boss, swore fealty with a handshake laced in deception, and with a nod of loyalty, he dug his knife into the corpse of his former master. D'Aquila fell in a rain of bullets, his reign crumbling into dust. Mineo was no fool. He had seen kings rise and fall, and he had orchestrated many of those falls himself. Now he was the architect of his own empire, second only to Masseria, but with power came paranoia, and with paranoia came the war. The streets of New York became a battlefield, the gutters swollen with the blood of those caught between Masseria and Maranzano's ambitions. Each week brought new bodies, each day new whispers of betrayal. The Castellamarese were closing in, their influence growing with each defection, their blades sharpening in the shadows. Mineo felt the walls constricting, the pressure mounting with every move he made. He had seen Morello, the seasoned war chief, fall to Maranzano's assassins, his body crumpled like discarded refuse in the streets. The message had been clear. No one was untouchable, not even Mineo. The meetings grew tense, Masseria barking orders, his fingers twitching on his ever-present cigarette. The old boss did not see the writing on the wall, but Mineo did. He had spent years navigating this world of shadows and daggers, and he knew that hesitation was a death sentence. He proposed a solution: strike first, take Maranzano before he could take them. Masseria had nodded, his lips curling in satisfaction, but Mineo knew that satisfaction was fleeting. The war was shifting. He could feel it in his bones. November 5th, 1930. The air had a bite to it, a forewarning laced in the cold. Mineo had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they whispered of danger. But caution was not enough to stop the inevitable. He and Ferrigno stepped into the courtyard, their breath visible in the evening chill. The apartment windows loomed above them, dark eyes peering into their souls. The first crack of gunfire shattered the quiet, and Mineo felt the sting before he heard the screams. Bullets tore through flesh and bone, the force sending them stumbling. Ferrigno reached for his gun, his fingers slick with his own blood, but the second wave of fire finished what the first had started. Mineo fell, his body heavy with the weight of betrayal. As his vision blurred, he saw the shadowed figures retreating from the window above. He knew in his final moments that the tides had turned once more. Masseria had been their target, but he had been the sacrifice. And in New York, sacrifices were always necessary. The sirens grew louder, the distant howls of the living descending upon the dead. The city would move on, as it always did, and the throne he had fought so hard to secure would be claimed by another. Death had come for Mineo not as a stranger but as an old friend.